For our story today, it comes from 1 Kings chapter 18, and if you're following along in your pew Bible, it's on page 283. So that's a quick reference for you. Theodore will read it for us out of the Children's Bible, but just a reference to what we're hearing, that this party of Elijah comes about 60 years after last week's lesson. Remember, King Solomon's son Rehoboam was given some bad advice and took it to show his power and strength and toughness, to be cruel to the people, and it split the kingdom. So in the northern kingdom of Israel, they've had coup after coup, and one king's been murdered after the other, and now we have King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, who have instituted the worship of Baal, and it is at this time that Elijah comes to speak to the people.
God sends fire. 1 Kings 18. King Ahab called everyone together as Elijah had said. The people stood waiting, wondering what would happen next. Elijah stepped forward to speak to them. "When are you people of Israel going to stop wavering and make up your minds?" he asked. "Decide who is the true God and serve him. If Baal is really God, serve him with all your heart. But if my God, the God of Israel, is the true God, then give him all the trust and obedience. You can't try to serve God and Baal. Today we shall hold a contest to find out which is the true God." Then Elijah turned to the Baal prophets. "Build an altar to Baal," he told them. "Put wood on it and place a sacrifice to Baal on top, but don't set it on fire. Call Baal to send fire himself to burn up his sacrifice." Baal was the god of rain and storm. He should be able to send lightning to set the sacrifice on fire. The Baal prophets prepared their altar and sacrificed carefully. They began to pray for the fire to come down and burn it. The people watched in silence. Nothing happened. The prophets grew desperate, and their prayers became mad yells and screams. They danced wildly around the altar, tearing their hair and imploring Baal to hear them. Elijah began to tease them. "Perhaps Baal is busy," he suggested, "or he may have dropped off to sleep. Try to wake him." In spite of all their wild shouts and capers, nothing at all happened. At last they collapsed, exhausted and hopeless. Then Elijah called the people to come close. First he mended the broken down altar of God that had once stood on the mountain. He laid wood and meat on it and then dug a trench around it. "Bring water and pour it over the sacrifice," he ordered. Large jars of precious water were brought on the sacrifice. Wood, altar were all thoroughly soaked. "Bring more," Elijah said. By the time they had finished, the water was pouring off the altar into the trench below. Everyone could see that Elijah had a far harder task than the prophets of Baal. All that water would put out any fire. Calmly, Elijah began to pray. "O God, you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Prove that you are still the God of Israel by sending fire." Immediately, the watching crowd saw flames light up the altar. In a moment, the sacrifice went up in smoke. Fierce fire burned up the wood and even the stones of the altar. It licked up the water in the trench and scorched the earth around. The people were amazed. They fell on their faces and shouted, "God is the true God. He is the only God." Elijah ordered them to seize the prophets of Baal and put them to death. Only that way, he believed, would the wicked and cruel worship of Baal be stamped out in the land of Israel.
Thank you, Theodore. That was a long reading. Good job. Well, let's just orient ourselves a little bit with this story because it's kind of an unusual story, and in order to make sense of a story for us today, we kind of need to know what was going on in that time period. Of course, I told a little bit about it before the story goes, but there's a little bit more to it. Who is this Baal figure that people are worshiping? Well, as I mentioned, King Ahab is king, and he marries Queen Jezebel, and this sort of shadowy God that's always been on the margins of interest for the people of Israel suddenly comes front and center as Queen Jezebel asks for temples to be built, has 450 prophets/priests for Baal, and another 400 for Baal's consort, Asherah. Elijah is the only prophet that is left for Adonai, the God of Israel. Now, something about Baal. Technically, Baal's a generic name for God, like a lowercase g. But there was one regional god in particular that had captured the people's imagination. And the first time we hear about it is actually at the end of Exodus. That as the people have been freed from slavery and they're waiting at the base of the mountain of God, and Moses has gone up to the mountain to speak with God, he's gone for so long that the people start to question that Moses is ever coming back. And they grab Aaron and force him to make a golden calf, a golden bull, so that they can worship him. We continue to see little bits of this temptation to worship the god Baal because in a desert climate, the god Baal was a rain god, a storm god, the lightning god. So the people, yes, they worship Adonai, the God of Israel, but just in case Adonai doesn't come through when they actually need rain, the people would play with worshiping Baal. And as the story went, that the people knew well, every summer the god of Baal would fight the god of death, Mot, and lose. And then in the fall, when they needed crops to grow, the people would engage in cultic sexual practices and self-laceration to bring Baal back. Baal would see this activity and with his female consort make the land fertile. Worshipping Baal also sometimes demanded child sacrifice. In short, worshipping Baal was a horrific thing. It doesn't matter if Baal was real or not. Engaging in worship to this particular god was based off of fear and asked for self-inflicted pain and horrible sacrifice. If you remember in Genesis, there's that odd story where Abraham is asked to bring his only son Isaac up to the mountain and sacrifice him. And just before Abraham does, God says, "Stop." That story has a lot of meanings, but one of the meanings is almost as if God was trying to say, I am not like these other gods who would demand child sacrifice. I am different than those gods. So God doesn't prohibit the worship of Baal because God is like some jealous boyfriend screening your phone calls and your text messages. The reason God doesn't want us to worship other gods is because no other gods care. No other God is good for us. No other God deserves our worship and our time and our energy and our family and our money. Nothing. When Elijah challenges the people to this contest, it's for the sake of the people. And Elijah sets everything up in Baal's favor. Mount Carmel was a sacred site for Baal. The symbol of the bull that was used for the sacrifice is the symbol of Baal. And Baal is known as the lightning god, so asking for fire to come down from heaven onto the sacrifice was almost having it in the bag. Elijah even dumps 12 buckets of water on his sacrifice to make it nearly impossible for him to win. He was trying to prove to the people that God is the real God, more powerful than Baal and worthy of their worship. And in the end of the story, the people are impressed, but unfortunately, the worship of Baal does not go away. It continues to be a problem in 1st and 2nd Kings. In 2 Kings chapter 21, King Manasseh infamously sacrifices his own son to Baal. Later, good King Josiah purges the temple of all instruments for idol worship, but it's almost too late. When the Babylonians come and destroy the temple hundreds of years later, many people see this as God's final judgment against their consistent long-term idol worship. Elijah's critique that the people go limping back and forth between two different opinions, two different gods, is valid for us today too. But what the other God is may not be as apparent, because there are many approved of idols in our culture that either get ignored by the church or tolerated. And I want to be clear that these other gods are not some demonic or evil force by themselves. In fact, they actually don't exist. They're nothing. But we make them into gods, hoping they will give them something that they cannot actually give. We decide to put our trust into them, and in turn, we may sacrifice our health and our bodies and our children and our time and our money and even our souls in the process. And an idol is just something that we put our trust in that isn't God, Adonai. Not because God is a jealous boyfriend, but because nothing else holds us up. Nothing else can do the job. So what are these gods? Well, many people will throw out the easy answer of money. And I think that is one for us to always be observant with. We do need money to operate in our system. It's not bad in and of itself, but how much it dominates our life is up to us. What are we willing to sacrifice unto the altar of money? That's up to us. Companies where the sole purpose is to make as much money as possible tend to sacrifice human life in the process. Right before Halloween, I just read an article about some of the biggest chocolate companies that we know and love still use child labor in other countries, reporting children of ages 12 to 16 working up to 80 hours a week. And these children report regular beatings by their bosses. That's disgusting. At what point does selling a chocolate bar at a low price to make your consumer happy become more important than human life? Where's the altar? What God are they worshiping? There are many examples of companies who've gone to dubious and downright demonic practices in the name of money. And of course, they go to lengths to hide this from consumers. And honestly, we don't even want to know. This is what makes consumerism and the almighty dollar, when it's unchecked, become an idol that demands human life. Less obviously, but certainly present, is our culture of busyness. A few weeks ago in confirmation, I asked the kids to think about a time during the week that they have Sabbath, rest time. It may not be a full day, maybe half a day. It's funny, there was a lot of silence. It took them a long time to come up with any answer at all. And when I ask most people how they are, the most frequent answer I get is busy. And I find that interesting. What are we saying yes to and why? When do we say what's enough? God gave the Sabbath commandment to rest once a week because all created beings, including humans, need to rest. It's part of nature, and we aren't any better than nature. We literally start to go insane when we don't have time to rest. Furthermore, being so busy in our lives exhausts us that we don't have the energy for the good stuff in life. We don't have the energy to question things that need to be questioned, and the energy to notice things that need noticing. Being so busy often means that family time, sleep, nutrition, and sometimes sanity gets sacrificed. And why do we do this? Well, for one, the culture encourages it. I notice a lot of commercials and how they glorify the busy family racing around, everybody with their phones in their faces. And they acknowledge that we're all exhausted, but they bless it and sell us a product to make life just a little bit easier without actually questioning the system. But there are more and more people who are questioning the system. I follow these different movements going on in our culture, like the tiny house movement, which is a really fun show to watch. People who aggressively pay off debt and move into a tiny little home where they have to give away 80% of their possessions. There are people who are unplugging their life from computers and phones and going almost backward in time, trying to rediscover those soul-nurturing effects of nature, silence, family time, games, reading, sleep, doing things with your own hands, rediscovering their souls. There's one guy, Colin Wright, who is an example of a movement called minimalism, where people try to think about what it is that they really believe in and try to live an intentional life. And there's a picture of a guy who's just sitting in a small space about as big as this pulpit, and every possession he owns is around him. It all fits in a single backpack. And he's happy, and he admits that that may not necessarily be how everybody wants to go, but that's what works for him. He reevaluated his life and made that decision. My point is this. Elijah was worried about the people of Israel, and I think if Elijah was here today in our country, he'd be worried about us too. He would sternly challenge us to a test to see what God really has our back. The gods of the culture will eat us up and spit us out. They don't care. God does. Giving our loyalty and our very soul to God, Adonai, is a very safe thing to do, because God seeks for our healing and our wholeness and our well-being on a very deep level. A relationship with God leaves us better off than with others. So today I leave you with a challenge. Not to pour water on an altar and ask God to come down in fire to prove he's real. Honestly, I think that's missing the point of the story. The challenge is this. Write down what your priorities are, what gives you life, what you want to be the most important things. And then spend the week evaluating where you're actually putting your energy and your time and your money and your family. And then ponder what it is that God might be asking of you and see if there's any way to make your priorities shift a bit. And the answer is not going to look the same for me or for any of you, but as people of faith, sometimes we need wake-up calls. And today's story is your wake-up call. Amen.